I've been with Chr Hansen for nearly 20 years. I'm the business manager for cultures and enzymes for Australia and New Zealand. And I reckon this is probably one of the most interesting projects we've undertaken. Hugh gave me a call about 3 or 4 years ago, and I get these sorts of calls all the time. You know, guys, girls ringing me to ferment all sorts of crazy things. And but this particular one was just a little bit different and actually a little bit special. And coffee really probably represents one of the last frontiers for us at Chr Hansen, because we play in every one of the large fermentation industries in the world. So I said to Hugh, let's do it. And 3 or 4 years later, we've conducted trials across 10, 12 different countries, 20 or 30 trials, and in each of those we learned something new, and the results have been outstanding from what we hear. And at Chr Hansen, we've been around for a very long time. 1874, we were the first guys. Well, Chr Hansen, he worked out a way of extracting the enzyme out of a calf stomach, and that enzyme is rennet. And he took the world by storm with that. And from there, we developed a range of cultures. And the cheese industry today, you know, has resolved lots of the issues that wild fermentation was bringing back in those days. And so cheese, and this is all varieties of cheese, are generally produced with starter cultures and enzymes, and probably 1 in 2 cheeses around the world are made with a Chr Hansen culture. A few years ago, in 2017, I think it was, we were actually awarded a pretty special award. We were given the award of most sustainable company in the world by Corporate Knights, and that's because bacteria is all that we do, and the technology behind the bacteria and what it does naturally really does produce better food, safer food. It saves with food waste. We're replacing the use of chemicals in agriculture and all sorts of things. So this project in coffee really, it's really up our alley, you could say. We have 4,000 employees around the world. We're represented in every sort of corner of the world, and we're market leaders in cheese, yogurt, fermented meats like salami, wine, brewing, probiotics, and a host of other things. I'll just go to the next slide. So these are the areas that we play in, and the heartland for us is really cheese, and that sort of gets represented towards the other side of the slide. But recently, we've got 40,000 strains in our collection. We've isolated and purified and commercialised a few hundred of those strains, but we have so much unknown in that sort of 40,000 strains that we continue to mine those strains with our scientists in Denmark, and we have found solutions to all sorts of world problems. So, for example, in natural plant protection, we have a strain that we put into soil, and we help reduce the instances of nematodes in sugarcane at the moment, which would otherwise be, you know, addressed with chemicals or agricultural chemicals. So it's a natural way of increasing yield and addressing food waste. We supply cultures into silage. Animal nutrition is huge. Instead of using antibiotics or other pharmaceutical drugs to increase yield and growth rates, we give beef and pigs, chickens, probiotics to promote growth. So again, a natural way of addressing that issue. In the area of quality and safety, this really comes into this comes into play here with coffee, and it's probably our biggest new area of science is finding strains that can address either food safety and extending shelf life and preventing food from becoming rotten or wasting. So and Emil will go into this in greater detail, but the instances of fermentations going feral, going in the wrong direction, or having yeast and molds take over when you don't want it to, we have natural solutions for that, and they can just create consistency and cleaner flavours. And we have solutions in those areas in dairy, in wine, and we're bringing that science to coffee beans. What else do we do? Healthy food. We have a couple of the most researched probiotic strains in the world. So a lot of the probiotics that you take, even if they're in either yogurt or in a container that you buy from a pharmacy, is most probably a Chr Hansen probiotic. And so with all that, Chr Hansen is the largest manufacturer of bacteria in the world. So I think the industries that I've spoken about all have problems, and they all have challenges which can be addressed naturally. And I think from what we're learning about coffee, and we're really learning, we are experts in dairy and wine and fermented meats and so on and so forth, but coffee for us, we admit, is something really new, but we're experts in fermentation. And so with the amount of coffee that's produced out there, and starting at the specialty end of the marketplace really makes sense for us to really prove that we can make more consistent, better quality, really great tasting coffee beans is something that we're really determined to try to achieve. So on that note, I will hand over to Emil, who is one of our scientists in Denmark. He looks after our fermented beverages portfolio and sits in our wine team. So on that, Emil Eriksson.
All right, thank you for that, Carlo. You guys look amazing up here. Feel a bit weird, like I'm preaching to a choir or something. Such an honor to be here tonight. Thanks to ONA team for hosting us tonight. It's really nice, even though it is that far away from the safe space at home in Denmark. All right, my name is Emil, and as Carlo said, I work in the technical department, working with the application of our cultures, both bacteria and yeast, in the application of fermented beverages. So that will be wine and beer, but most certainly also coffee, which we are here to talk about today. The journey of coffee fermentation starts with the beginning of coffee production, I would say. So it's not that fermentation of coffee is something new. That's something that is very known to most people that work with coffee. But the journey for Chr Hansen started maybe 10 years ago, when the first trials were done with these non-Saccharomyces yeast. And it seemed obvious to move into a fermentation space where starter cultures were not used yet. Can you hear me? That's better. That's better. I can hear myself at least. That's good. So yeah, it seemed obvious to move into this fermentation of coffee, since starter cultures are not that used, and it's a huge opportunity to actually take control of that fermentation to ensure that you have better consistency and better products in the end. So when Hugh and the team started to work with our cultures, we were of course on board, and have now done a lot of trials in more than 10 countries with more than 20 different farmers, and the feedback is generally really good, especially once you have everything tuned in for that specific production. and the feedback like the best coffee that they ever produced, and the elimination of usual defects has been mentioned. So that's definitely a huge potential also going forward. We are sure about that. All right. So as mentioned, I'm a fermentation expert. I'm not necessarily a coffee processing expert. So I'm sure that a lot of you guys that are here tonight will actually know a lot more about coffee processing than I do. But I tried to map out here how I have learned about coffee processing and how I see it, and why fermentation is important for the final quality of the coffee. So of course you would start with a harvest and some sort of quality control. Maybe you sort, maybe you do a pre-treatment, maybe you pulp the coffee, maybe you don't. You decide whether you want to dry it straight away as a whole cherry, maybe you pulp it and then dry it as a honey process. And then recently it's getting more and more popularity to also do this pre-treatment step of fermentation in a vessel. That can be a tank, a bin, a sacket, even a very large concrete open tank. This can be done again with or without pulping. This can be done with or without additional water. There's also the innovative method of CM process that the ONA team has been a big part of developing, where you add the gas to take out all the oxygen from the fermentation, making it even more anaerobic. And then after that you have to decide how you want to dry it. Do you want to dry it as a whole cherry? Do you want to pulp it or wash it and then dry it, and so on. So during all these steps you have different risk of having spoilage, and especially when trying to push the fermentations for longer times and drying on very wet cherries, you have huge risk of spoilage from either molds or from yeast or from other bacteria that could give off flavors. So as mentioned, all coffee is fermented basically. Even I would argue the washed version, where you do try to remove all the nutrients, all the mucilage from the coffee, either mechanically or just by adding water. But even here, it's not possible to take out all of it. So some nutrients will still be left, and some fermentation will happen while it's drying with this. So all coffee is fermented, and the purpose of many of these traditional processes that are widely known are actually to minimize fermentation and to ensure that the fermentation is not spoiling the product. So when we then try to, instead of minimizing the fermentation, begin to push the fermentation to induce the positive notes that you can actually gain from these fermentations, then you are of course also inducing a huge risk of spoilage. There can be the vinegar off flavors, the balsamic flavors, it could be boozy off flavors or multi-character umami flavors. It's also widely known as a defect from fermentation, and then just in general these unclean fermentation notes. So that of course makes the decision whether to ferment your coffee or not, or to push the fermentation of the coffee more or not do it, more difficult to make, since even though you know that you might be able to get a larger value for your coffee after the fermentation, you still have a larger risk as well of actually getting a lower value for your coffee. At least as long as you're doing this as a wild fermentation. And the picture here is an example of that, where you actually have it's just a spontaneously wild fermentation of some coffee cherries, and it's just clear from this picture, I think. But looking over it, it's not uniform. It's a lot of mold growth. You can see some cherries having all white character and some being all black, and this will of course mean that you will have differences, especially when you go up in larger batch sizes. Then you would begin to have inconsistencies even within the same batch of fermentation, from one side of the tank to the other. So yeah, there's a lot of parameters to consider when when evaluating this risk of spoilage, and that it starts already in the coffee field. So on the trees, how you manage your crop, what is your terroir, what's the variety you chose, how does that come out for that specific vintage, how is the climate, which process do you decide to put it through, and especially also the batch sizes of these wild fermentations, and then of course also the drying period. So there's many places during this whole coffee processing chain that you would have a risk of spoilage from other microorganisms, and where you have a potential to actually protect your fermentation by inducing a starter culture. And it is still early days for starter culture in coffee production, but that doesn't mean that it's early days for starter cultures in general. Like Carlo just explained, it's been used for many years in a lot of different applications in the food industries, and Chr Hansen has been a part of that from the beginning. I see a lot of similarities with the wine industry when I compare how me myself coming from a wine background, actually mostly tasting it in the restaurants, but has both for me education, but also a huge interest in how wine is produced. I just see a lot of similarities with this that variety and terroir is important and that you have to have good quality fruit in order to produce good quality coffee. So it all starts in the field. But of course, microbes also play a major role, since you have to remove all these sugary fruit pulps from the bean in order to dry it, so that it becomes shelf stable, so that you can store it and roast it when you need it for selling. And this is where starter cultures can come in, and has done so in other applications like wine and beer, for instance. To think of a 100,000 liter fermentation of wine today without adding a starter culture is making that wine producer very nervous, I think, because that would be a huge risk if you were ending up spoiling that amount of wine. So both the wine and the beer industry today has come to a point where it's actually when you don't add starter culture that it's something special. And that will of course be amazing if we could get to that point someday with the coffee industry as well, that all coffee fermentations were controlled so that you would know what happens, and to have very little risk of spoilage from that. And then it would be the special cases where you didn't do that. And I really believe that one day in the near future that it will be like that in the coffee industry. So as I said, it's not something new to apply starter cultures. It's already back in the 60s that you started to use Saccharomyces yeast in coffee fermentations to inducing and controlling the fermentation, and with the involvement of techniques to identify what is actually present in a fermentation. During the last 20 years, huge steps have been made there. So we know more and more each year about what is actually happening in the different processes and what is actually present at the time of fermentation. And I've put in, it might be a little small for you to see, but I can tell you that this shows different processing methods, and that the initial population of both yeast and bacteria starts low, and then later in the fermentation it had gone high. This seems very simple, but it confirms that fermentation is happening, and confirms that whatever was present in the beginning has grown to have changed the product, and potentially also can spoil the product. And looking into the flora of spontaneous or wild ferments, it is also clear that the vast majority of what is present in the beginning of these fermentations is non-Saccharomyces yeast. This is the same that we see in a wine fermentation, where in the beginning you would have it dominated by the wild non-Saccharomyces yeast present from the grape and from the winery, and then after a few days or maybe up to 5 days, then if you were making it as a wild fermentation, then you would see the Saccharomyces yeast taking over. The Saccharomyces yeast is the one that we know from beer fermentation and from wine fermentation and from bread fermentation. Is sort of the power horse yeast that facilitates this alcoholic fermentations. But at the same time, if you were to inoculate that already in the beginning of any fermentation, that being wine or coffee cherries, then you would also outcompete this wild flora straight away, and whatever potential positive notes that you would also have gotten from that wild will then not be present. So that is where inoculating a non-Saccharomyces yeast in the beginning actually comes in handy, that you can mimic this wild fermentation that you usually like whenever it turns out great, at least. So that is why we believe that the strain and the culture that we have is actually able to mimic a successful wild fermentation of coffee, but with the added consistency and the added control and the loss of the risk of spoilage, so that you can actually plan and know what's going to happen in your fermentation. So that brings me to the actual solution that we have. It is 2 different cultures. One is a bacteria and one is a non-Saccharomyces yeast. So the non-Saccharomyces yeast called Smart Bev Boost PK1. If you look at the picture, there is on the top a bin inoculated with this yeast. You can see all the cherries being with a thin layer of this yeast. This is after 7 days fermentation, so you really see that it's uniform, it's protected against the molds. You don't have nothing of all that inconsistency that you saw in the other picture. And at the same time, it will have done the job of a wild fermentation, or similar to a wild fermentation, but with the controlled aspects. So it will boost these varietal characteristics. It will take precursors from the skin and from the fruit pulp and make that into aroma compounds that account for these fruity and nice flavors that we know from anaerobically fermented coffee. The other one is the bacteria product. So that's a lactic acid bacteria, sort of in the name, that lactic acid is a big part of that bacteria. It produces lactic acid from sugar, meaning that you can get the protection from the lowered pH, the added sensory aspects of controlling the acidity in the cup, the mouthfeel, and further, just providing protection against whatever acetic acid bacteria or other lactic acid bacteria that might produce acetic acid, so that you don't get this balsamic off flavor. So combining the two, co-inoculating them, putting these 2 bins together, fermenting at the same time, would then mean that you would get this rapid acidification and thereby also the protection from spoilage, while you would still have the facilitated flavor boost of these varietal characteristics that are already present in the coffee. Which I think is also very important to note, that of course it will not be, if you apply this solution to 10 different coffee sources, then you would not get the same coffee out of all those 10. It will still be 10 different coffees, but it will be the flavors of that terroir and that specific coffee that will be boosted and highlighted in a clean way. But it does require some trialing trialing and error in each production to see how it fits into that specific production. This is an example of one of those trials where we have some beautiful cherry here being inoculated as an anaerobic dry fermentation in these 200-liter bins. So it's basically the culture is just sprayed while you fill it, and then the middle picture is after 7 days of fermentation, seeing clear and uniform fermentation all over, while this control is then from the same batch of harvested coffee, but fermented wild, so without the addition of culture, but other than that, everything else was done the same. And it's, I think, very clear. Now I wasn't there to smell it myself, but Hugh has said that, that it was very clear that it was also a clean, nice, fruity smell from the middle one, while the control was smelling like it looks, basically. So, of course, comparing a wild ferment where you simply just harvest crop and put it in the tank, and then comparing that to having to buy a culture and adding it, you would need to have some assurance that you would actually get some return on investment for that. That assurance is, of course, something that has to be developed. So it's not that you from the beginning would just add the culture and then you just know that you would have this increase from 75 to 86 points. That is just one example of a really good example, I think, but of actually some Australian coffee here, where it was elevated from 75 points for the control uninoculated to 86, with flavor descriptors going from these baggy, flat and murky flavors to the varietal characteristics instead. And other successful mentionings could be these for the Brewers Cup for the World Brewers Cup in 2021, where some of these varieties that are known to have some defects, like Uvinoides and Liberica, and have some difficulties, were actually elevated to take some of the top spots of that competition. Both produced with this solution of a non-Saccharomyces yeast and a lactic acid bacteria. But I think the key takeaways is that it is something that has to be developed. It's a collaboration where you try it out in your production with your coffee, with your variety and terroir, and with your processes, however they are, and then after some trial and error, once you have everything settled so that you know how the fermentation works, then you could actually be able to, okay, next year we need 3 containers of fermented coffee. How many tanks do we need? How much cultures do we need? Make sure to have it in stock, and then it's actually just execution from there. So that's the ultimate goal, of course, to come there, but it does need to be trialed before we just go straight into that period. But the potential definitely is there. Yeah, so that was it from me. Please, there are some one-pagers, and also you can scan this QR code to get to our webpage where there's some more information. You can also download the one-pager from there and get the contact details if you are interested in actually doing a collaboration with us. All right, so you all enjoyed that.
Thanks, Emil. Today we also brought some drinks for you to enjoy. There were some beers and some wines that you may have already tasted. I'll just tell you a little bit about those because they're actually fermented with very similar cultures to what we're working with here in the coffee industry. So Hop Nation are a multi-award winning brewery based in Melbourne. They were awarded the medium best brewery at the International Beer Awards in 2021. we've helped them design 3 new beers which are non-alcoholic. And typically, non-alcoholic beer is really difficult to produce without a de-alkalization system, basically stripping or taking the alcohol out of beer. So one of the really magical things about the non-Saccharomyces yeast that we're playing with here is it doesn't produce alcohol. It produces lots of other things, which such as esters, which together with the natural flavours that are present in the beer, or even if it's wine or the cherries, accentuate the natural terroir or the natural flavours of the beverage. So there's an XPA which is made with that pickier yeast. There's a raspberry sour which is also co-fermented with the Harvest LB1 that you've just learnt about. So check those out. There's also two wines. There's a Church Road Sauvignon Blanc. Now, typically Sauvignon Blanc is obviously made with a Saccharomyces yeast. Just prior to that primary fermentation, we add a non-Saccharomyces yeast to that wine. And the winemaker uses it as a tool, basically, to really lift the natural characteristics of the grape. So what you'll notice there is that you'll get really lifted flavours of passion fruit, especially, and possibly peach, I think, in that one, which we also find is typical of some of the experiments that we've done around the world. And we see all sorts of flavours coming through with these non-Saccharomyces, from pear and apple to passion fruit, banana and pineapple. So it really lifts what is already naturally present there and accentuates it. There's a red wine there from the Barossa, it's a Grenache, and it uses a combination of Saccharomyces and non-Saccharomyces yeast. And there we're really bringing some extra boost of flavour together with texture as well. So the yeast can bring some aminoproteins which add to the palate weight and increase the quality of the wine. So on that note, enjoy those beverages. I think they're really great examples. Enjoy the cheeses and the slimies that are over there as well. I'm not sure, but there's a good chance there's a Chr Hansen culture in there as well. And I'll hand you back over. Thank you.
So yeah, thank you so much for coming. We're going to hang around